This is the hidden story of the American Army's attacks on South Korean refugees during the Korean War in 1950. No actual archive exists of these precise incidents, but all the archive images in this film used to illustrate the Korean War were taken during the Korean War, almost all of them filmed by US Forces cameramen.
Headquarters, 5th Air Force, 25 July 1950. The Army has requested that we strafe all civilian parties that are approaching our positions. To date, we have complied with the Army request. Eighth Army Headquarters, secret, 3 January 1951. You have complete authority in your zone to stop all civilian traffic. Responsibility to place fire on them, to include bombing, rests with you. Headquarters, 25th Infantry Division, 26 July 1950. General Keane directed that all civilians moving around in the combat zone will be considered as unfriendly and shot.
There was kids out there. It didn't matter what it was. 880, blind, crippled, or crazy, they shot them. It just seemed like all Koreans were the enemy.
We were just shooting openly. We didn't aim at somebody. Just pointing our rifles and shooting. And in that 10 minutes that it went on, that was a nightmare in itself. Yeah, the guilt's still with me. I can't get rid of the guilt. I can't find peace of mind. Absolution, it's not there.
I remember seeing this woman on her hands and knees. She was crawling. You could just see the bullets bouncing, tracer bullets bouncing around her. She kept crawling. Finally, I guess, you know, she was just hit, and that was it. And she just stopped, just like that, you know, just like she was hanging on the side of this hill with her fingers.
In the village of Kokan-ri, near the south coast of Korea, the Lee family gather to honor their war dead. This ancient Confucian custom requires living descendants to pay homage to their ancestors. On August the 10th, 1950, 6 weeks into the Korean War, several hundred members of the Lee family took refuge in their family shrine. 24 hours later, 82 of them were dead, including 29 children under the age of 10. The irony is that they were all killed by troops sent to protect them from the North Korean invasion, American troops. The South Korean Defense Ministry has registered 61 separate incidents of alleged U.S. attacks on civilians. Last year, the U.S. government finally acknowledged one of them. Tokyo was a dream posting for any young GI in the spring of 1950, with its shattered economy and thriving black market. You could buy a carton of cigarettes at the PX for $1 and sell it on the street for 10. And $10 would buy you a Japanese wife for a month. Life was easy. There was guard duty and marching on parade, but you never expected to fight.
The trolley.
I remember waiting for a streetcar to take me into downtown Tokyo. And I said to myself at that point, when you look back on this time, you're going to remember it as a really good time, because it really is the best time of your life.
Most GIs only had 2 weeks of combat training in the summer and had rarely fired their weapons. The North Korean invasion of the South on June the 25th changed all of that.
Some guys were buying knives down in Japan. They were sharpening them up, putting in their boots, and, you know, like it was going to really be like being in a movie or something, so to speak.
We were only told we're moving to Korea. The Koreans crossed the 38th parallel, which nobody knew where it was. Nobody cared. To us, we thought it was just an uprising, something that would be over in no time.
American soldiers from Japan were rushed to the deteriorating front line. In their very first contact with the North Koreans, they were outmaneuvered and soundly defeated. Retreat was the only option.
North Korean forces have driven 60 miles south of Seoul to a point only 15 miles from Daejeon. Here, United States troops, backed by powerful air and artillery concentrations, have temporarily halted the communist tank drive, but no solid defense line has been formed.
It was time to bring in the cavalry. The 7th Cavalry Regiment, General George Custer's old unit, landed in Pahang on July the 22nd.
I remember seeing a large banner, big white banner that stretched across the street there. It said, "Welcome Americans, run commies run." And all the South Koreans alongside the road, they were waving and cheering us on. It made us feel real good. We thought when we'd show up, you know, it'd be all over with, probably in a short time. But we had absolutely no idea of what we were walking into. And I mean, we walked into it.
Things began to go wrong immediately. Within 2 days in Korea, the 7th Cavalry had shot several of their own men. On the next night, July the 25th, elements were positioned on a hillside a few miles behind the front line. Rumors went around that the North Koreans had made a breakthrough, causing mass panic. In the morning, 119 cavalrymen were unaccounted for, along with many of the unit's heavy weapons.
It was just nothing but mass confusion. You didn't know. You stop here, dig in, or just wait, or we're going to have to leave, or you're going to. Nobody knew what was going on. Matter of fact, I didn't even know if we had a platoon leader. Majority of the time, I didn't know if we had a platoon sergeant. There was nobody in charge. There was nobody in charge.
Ill-trained, poorly led and frightened, the 7th Cavalry was confronted with streams of refugees fleeing the front some 6 miles away. By this stage of the war, nearly 2 million refugees, the so-called people in white, clogged the roads. Not only did they play havoc with road communications, but fears ran high of the North Koreans using refugee columns as cover to infiltrate behind U.S. lines. At this point, the stage was set for one of the worst atrocities in American military history. It began at the village of Im-Keri on the 25th of July.
American soldiers broke into our house with rifles and bayonets. They didn't even take off their boots. They searched inside the house with a torch, found us and ordered us out. I was young and scared. I hid behind my mother and father, clinging to them. My father said the Americans had come to evacuate us, and we should pack up and leave our home. The Americans forced us out of our village. We didn't know anything, so we just followed them, because they said they'd take us to safety.
Forced to evacuate their village, the Korean refugees soon came face to face with the frightened, inexperienced soldiers of the 7th Cavalry.
A lot of refugees came down the road in a group. It was 50, 60, 70 people. So I ran up the road there by the railroad tracks to Captain Johnson and told him. He said, go down, take the machine gun, shoot those people, and we'll pull out. I said, we can't kill all these people. And he pulled out his handgun, a .45, and pointed it at my head, and he said, I said, kill them. Said, you're disobeying a direct order in combat. He says, I will kill you myself. He said, go back there and kill those people. I said, yes, sir. I turned and I'm running. And I'm thinking all the time in my head, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? And I got back down there and I told my friend what I was ordered and what had happened. And he fired around down amongst them somewhere. I think he did shoot someone, one person. And after he seen we were serious, they began getting off the road pretty fast. And to this day, I've thought, did I do the right thing or the wrong thing?
Later the next morning, U.S. troops forced the refugee column, now several hundred strong, onto the railway line overlooked by the 7th Cavalry's main positions. There they were stopped and searched around midday.
I was at the head of a long line of people. I could see the American soldiers standing with rifles, trying to keep us on the tracks. They seemed to make sure that we couldn't move at all.
The U.S. troops then withdrew, leaving the refugees alone on the railway line.
Just after 1 o'clock, I could see a reconnaissance plane circling above us. Then the Americans seemed to talk to each other on the radio.
Then we heard the shrieking sounds of planes overhead. Terrifying noise.
And then they dropped bombs on the contained group of people. Suddenly, a huge explosion erupted.
I crawled out from under my mother and climbed on top of her. I shouted, "Mom, Mom!" But she was dead. When I stroked her head with my hand, I found my hand sliding inside. I didn't know what hit my mother, but the back of her head was blown off.
그때만 이제 어렸으니까 깜짝 놀래가지고 그랬는데 이만한 불덩이가 와가지고 내 마음에 이만한.
All of a sudden, a huge fireball slammed into my face. It was such a terrible shock. I looked down and I could see my eyeball hanging from a thread.
나물좀만큼.
I never knew it could be so big.
그래 탁 쎄는데 보니까
It was as big as my fist, dangling from my face.
이렇게 커. 눈이 이만이야.
The bullets from the planes were still raining down, but I couldn't take cover because of my eye, dangling in the air.
그냥 총알이 피우듯 하는데 엎드리들 못해. 이것이 걸고치서 못 걸고치서.
I begged, please, Mum, pull off my eye so I can crawl under you. She couldn't reach me. She was so badly injured. So she told me to do it myself, and I tried. But for the life of me, I could not pull it off. All the people around me were dead. So again, I turned back to my mother for help. Mum, please, pluck my eyeball out. She said, no, I cannot. But I want to crawl under you, Mum, but I can't because of my eye. I couldn't believe how desperate I was to live.
그때 죽었으면 내가 이렇게 10번, 1000번을 안 죽었잖아. 나 1000번 죽은 것보다 더 하고 살았어, 나.
After the strafing and bombing, everything went quiet. Then I saw the American soldiers reappear. They started checking through the dead and living, poking the bodies lying on the railway line with their bayonets. Those who were still alive were forced to get up at gunpoint, and the Americans herded us further down the railroad tracks. So those of us who survived the bombing were made to move on again.
The survivors of the strafing, many of them badly wounded, were moved further down the railway line towards the village of No Gun Ri, directly beneath the guns of the 2nd Battalion of the 7th Cavalry.
I kind of looked to the left of that hill where the railroad tracks came around, and I see all these people, and they look like refugees. But there was a problem with that. They were in a organized manner, more like you'd look at a platoon of soldiers walking along. They were in a group, close together, not strung out, not like refugees would be walking down the side of a railroad track behind each other. They were in a group. They got about halfway down a railroad track. I said, what are we going to do? We can't let them just keep coming and coming. If there's enemy soldiers there, we're going to have a problem.
In my memory, I know there were Korean interpreters using loudspeakers, telling them that we weren't going to allow them through our lines and that they needed to disperse, but they didn't.
What are we going to do? We can't let them keep coming. So we called a fire mission. All we did was fire like a warning shot across the bow. You know, stop, go back, disappear, or do something. And you could hear the round pass overhead, and we were looking. All of a sudden, the round hit. And when it hit and exploded, of all things, it landed directly dead center of all these people. I mean, if you had hand carried it and placed it there, you couldn't have been more deadly accurate. And that round went off among all the people that's packed tightly together. That alerted the infantry, the machine gunners, and the riflemen. Immediately, I imagine their thoughts were enemy.
And then the small arms fire started.
Your man, yes, right down the line, he's running. Kill them all. So what do? And, of course, there was a lieutenant screaming like a madman to fire on everything. Fire on everything. Fire on everything. Kill them all. I shot too. I shot at the people. I don't know if they were soldiers or what. Kids, there was kids out there. It didn't matter what it was. 880, blind, crippled, or crazy, they shot them.
Didn't take aim to shoot. All we did was just fire a weapon. It wasn't like enjoying it. We were just doing it because we were scared and everything was just went crazy.
There was a hell of a lot of fire going. A hell of a lot of shooting. A hell of a lot of shooting. Because I know the infantrymen, how we used to carry 10, 15 bandoliers of ammunition. And even help machine gunners carrying ammunition. There was a hell of a lot of expenditure of ammunition.
It was probably the first time a lot of the, if not all of them, had been okayed to fire on people. And so the firing turned into a frenzy.
Hundreds of terrified refugees, those who survived the initial onslaught, ran into the railway tunnels of Nogan-Ri. They were to remain there, under rifle and machine gun fire, for the next 3 days.
The floor inside the tunnel was a mix of gravel and sand. People clawed with their bare hands to make holes to hide in. Other people piled up the dead, like a barricade, and hid behind the bodies as a shield against the bullets.
Everybody just ceased moving. No one was moving over there. They either were dead or so seriously wounded they couldn't move, or if they were alive, they weren't moving because they move, they know there's going to be fired at some more.
A baby boy's mother was killed during the strafing on the rail track. The father managed to get the baby to the tunnels, but the boy was hungry and frightened. He cried and cried. And the American troops fired their guns into the tunnels whenever the boy cried. The bullets fired in the direction of the crying. People screamed that more would be shot if the baby kept crying. The father didn't know what to do. He might have thought the baby would die anyway, but he decided to silence it in order to save the others. He took the boy to the back of the tunnel and pushed him face down into a pool of water. I watched him doing that and thought, what could be more tragic than this? I clung to my mother, and despite her pain and injuries, she hugged me tightly. I cried like mad. I was so scared of the dead bodies piled up inside the tunnel. I still have vivid memories of people crying and moaning because of the shooting. There were so many cries in the tunnel. I can still see bodies writhing in agony.
The final death toll at Nogan-ri will never be known. 181 victims have been reported. The Korean survivors believe as many as 400 may have been killed. Of those reported dead, more than 3/4 were women, children, or men over 40. 1 in 4 of the known dead were children under the age of 10. It took 50 years for the massacre at Nogan-ri to be made public. The killings raised serious questions about the conduct of US forces in Korea. Why were unarmed civilians shot? And who was ultimately responsible? A group of journalists working for the Associated Press began an investigation into Nogan-ri based on declassified documents and interviews with survivors and veterans. It was published in newspapers around the world in 1999. Until then, the Pentagon had dismissed the allegations of mass killings, claiming that the 7th Cavalry were not even in the area at the time. The AP journalists had to plot the positions of various army units on combat maps from the period in order to prove that the 7th Cavalry were present at Nogan-ri. The AP team were awarded the Pulitzer Prize for their investigative work.
Oh, it's very interesting as we've gone along to see how the documents in detail back up what the Korean villagers say about such things.
Their report left America deeply shocked. In response, the Pentagon was directed to lead a thorough investigation. Its findings were published in January 2001.
We have determined, however, that U.S. soldiers killed or injured an unconfirmed number of Korean refugees in the last week of July 1950 during a withdrawal under pressure in the vicinity of Nogan-ri.
The Pentagon acknowledged that U.S. forces did kill refugees at Nogan-ri, but the report carefully avoided admitting responsibility. It argued that refugees may have been strafed by U.S. planes, but that these were not deliberate attacks, that based on available evidence, U.S. commanders did not issue orders to shoot civilians in the vicinity of Nogan-ri, that the deaths were an unfortunate tragedy inherent to war and not deliberate killings. The Pentagon declined to be interviewed, but the official who oversaw the inquiry, now no longer working for the Pentagon, agreed to speak to us.
From a command responsibility perspective, the investigation and the report that ensued felt that this was not an action that had been directed by higher command authority, that this was within the rules of engagement of people who thought that their lives were in danger and that they were responding to a threat.
But documents found in the U.S. National Archives contradict the Pentagon's findings. Just the day before the shootings began at Nogan-ri, Colonel Turner Rogers, the operations chief of the U.S. 5th Air Force in Korea, sent a memo to his boss. Rogers wrote,
"The Army has requested that we strafe all civilian refugee parties that are noted approaching our positions."
Rogers then confirmed that the U.S. Air Force had actually been attacking refugees at the request of the Army.
To date, we have complied with the Army request in this respect.
This key evidence was omitted from the Pentagon's report. Rogers argued that the shooting of refugees should not be indiscriminate. He recommended that 5th Air Force should not attack civilians unless
they are definitely known to contain North Korean soldiers or commit hostile acts.
Despite his recommendations, there is no evidence that the policy was ever changed. The Pentagon's claim that the strafing of civilians was not deliberate is refuted by Pete McCloskey, former congressman, Korean War veteran, and a member of the Pentagon's official advisory panel which oversaw the no-gun-re investigation.
The planes, particularly the jets, they couldn't tell who was down there, but they did have orders to strafe people in white approaching the position. The Valley Forge carrier, they unearthed a log that the Navy pilots were told to shoot any group of 8 or 10 civilians approaching the Army position. Well, I don't think there's any question that the strafing occurred, and under orders. There was no question that that was the order that the Air Force was obeying from the Army, strafe the refugees.
But did senior U.S. commanders order the 7th Cavalry to shoot civilians at no-gun-re? The Pentagon says that there is no evidence to prove that such orders were given to the 7th Cavalry. Other documents show that at the time, it was the policy of the 8th Army, the highest level of command in Korea, not to let civilians cross the lines.
No, repeat, no refugees to cross battle lines at any time. Movement of all Koreans in groups will cease immediately.
On the day the killings at no-gun-re began, more explicit orders to shoot refugees were given by the general commanding the neighboring division.
All civilians moving around in combat zone will be considered as unfriendly and shot.
The most telling written order was that received 2 days before no-gun-re by the 8th Cavalry, sister regiment to the 7th. Their radio log records an order from Division HQ, the same division to which the 7th Cavalry belonged, to shoot everyone trying to cross their lines.
No refugees to cross the line. Fire everyone trying to cross lines. Use discretion in the case of women and children.
The Pentagon statement that no equivalent orders exist in the 7th Cavalry regimental records is, on the face of it, true. But what the Pentagon didn't say is that the 7th Cavalry's communications log, the one that might have contained evidence of such orders, has disappeared.
What's extremely important to realize is that the single critical document that would have carried the orders to shoot the refugees at no-gun-re, the 7th Cavalry Regiment log, is missing from the National Archives inexplicably. And not only is it missing, but the Pentagon report does not disclose the fact that it's missing. And yet this report declares that there were no orders at no-gun-re. It declares that flatly, although it doesn't have the document that would prove that one way or the other.
The investigators, as historical sleuths, so to speak, knew that they would probably not unearth every single document, even documents that had been retained. So I don't think it's fair to say that they should be acknowledging what they didn't find. I think you have to build your conclusions based upon what you could find. And on that basis, they did a very comprehensive job. I'm sure that people can assert that there are other documents out there that might say something, but that's absolute speculation.
What do I know? Everybody knows the goddamn thing, what happened. The troops were ordered to shoot the civilians. They shot them. Now you're going to court-martial the troops instead of the goddamn big shots.
These were occupation troops, not really combat troops. It was the very first day of the war. They were in full retreat. Their awareness of the tactical situation was minimal. But that having been said, it can't excuse the deliberate targeting of civilians. Now, the law of war, even in that day, in 1950, is simple. You cannot purposely target civilians.
So were the civilian deaths at no-gun-re simply an unfortunate tragedy, as the Pentagon concludes, or the result of a deliberate policy to target refugees? In the first months of the war, at least 14 other documents from high-ranking officers point to a widespread policy of treating South Korean refugees as the enemy. They go unreported in the Pentagon investigation.
Shoot all refugees coming across the river. All refugees are fair game. Refugees will be considered enemy and dispersed by all available fire, including artillery.
The abundance of documents testifying to U.S. Army commanders ordering their troops to shoot civilians may explain why so many alleged incidents have been registered with the South Korean authorities. It is clear that American troops and their commanders feared refugee columns were being used by the North Korean Army to infiltrate American positions. But that doesn't explain the apparent indifference that senior U.S. officers showed towards the people in white. One week after the massacre at No-Gun-Ri, the 1st Cavalry Division had retreated across the Naktong River. Thousands of refugees fleeing the fighting were massing on the western banks, trying to cross. At dusk on the 3rd of August 1950, General Hobart Gay ordered the demolition of the bridge at Waegwan. Up in the air with the bridge went hundreds of refugees, General Gay recorded in his memoirs. North Korean enemy forces were not to reach the Naktong River for a further 4 days. Further down the river, on the same day, the bridge at Tuksong-dong was blown up as refugees were running across. Results excellent, the 14th Combat Engineers noted. But the civilian deaths were never reported. With the bridges blown, Korean civilians were desperate and began wading across the river.
When we were halfway across the river, what looked like American soldiers began shooting at us. First, my father, who was in front, was shot. Then my younger brother was hit. I hid behind our cow, holding its tail. As the shooting became heavier, I saw piles of dead bodies floating down the river like straw.
South Korean civilians were even attacked when they were stationary and not approaching American positions. Seeking safety from the battle for the port of Pahang in late August 1950, over 1,000 civilians took refuge on a sheltered beach. In full view of U.S. warships stationed off the coast, they remained there for several days. At 11 o'clock on the morning of September the 1st, 1950, the warships suddenly and unexpectedly opened fire.
Of all the terrible images I remember the most, it's the moment my sister's head was blown off and my mother lost one of her breasts. These 2 images have haunted me my entire life. A little baby from our family was also killed, but how could I possibly forget seeing my sister's head being blown off in front of my eyes?
In just 40 minutes, it is thought that 400 people died on the beach.
So many people were hit by shrapnel. So many were screaming and crying. The whole beach was full of mutilated bodies. Some people screamed, some collapsed, and others died instantly. The sound of the shells was so loud, the impact of the explosions huge. The warships were really close.
Over 1 million civilians died during the Korean War. How many deaths resulted from American attacks is unknown. But there is a great need among the survivors for their suffering to be recognized. This group of women from half a dozen villages were all victims of strafing by U.S. aircraft. They meet to share their experiences. Many want compensation, but that seems unlikely. The American government says it will not investigate any of the remaining 60 reported incidents of U.S. attacks on civilians, hoping that the no-gun re-inquiry would draw a line under the issue.
The American government, the Pentagon, don't want to see the truth come out if it will embarrass the government. I think it's almost a rule of political science, a law. The government will always lie about embarrassing matters. And when you're up in the Pentagon and full colonel and have a chance to make general, and general with a chance to become chief of staff, there's as much politics as high in the Pentagon as there is in the halls of Congress. And I think the Army just chose to try to downplay the terrible character of Army leadership in 1950.
This is a Pandora's box for the U.S. government. It does seem that a decision was made that they had to close the door on no-gun re in order to close the door on God knows how many other cases.
The investigating team was directed to investigate the no-gun re incident. Obviously, things that occurred after that were not subjected to the same degree of scrutiny by this investigative team because it was not part of its challenge.
The cover-up at No-Gun Re was not only an American affair. On the eve of the publication of the first AP report, the No-Gun Re Survivors Committee discovered that South Korean authorities had plastered over the bullet holes inside the tunnel.
When we saw the National Railroad plaster this tunnel up, we couldn't help thinking that there must be someone behind this cover-up. There must be hundreds of tunnels in Korea that are leaking. We're convinced they plastered it in order to cover it up.
But the survivors will not forget. Their committee has campaigned for compensation since 1960, and they're not about to give up now.
American investigators distorted and whitewashed the investigation. All the eyes of the world are looking to America to speak the truth about the events at No-Gun Re. They should not ignore the voices of weaker countries. I believe this attitude of the Americans should be known throughout the world, so the U.S. changes its position and repents.
The U.S. government is very unlikely to repent. It has refused to apologize formally for the killings at No-Gun Re, or to offer compensation to the survivors. But the American foot soldiers of the 7th Cavalry cannot forget. They have to live with the memory of No-Gun Re every day of their lives.
There's a little girl running down the tracks, which I thought I had killed. It's not a day goes by where it doesn't bother me. I dream of that little girl quite a bit, and that little girl, particularly, I'm holding by the hand. And I don't see her face, but I know it's her because the way her haircut is, that black, trimmed straight across on the bottom. And I wake up, cold sweat, shaking, scared, and I won't go back to sleep. I'm scared that the dream will come back on me. You can't forget it. No matter how much you try, no matter how much medication you take, it's there. It just eats you alive. And the older you get, the harder it is. We were in hell, and we only made it halfway back. Nobody knows. If I could turn the pages of time back, I would have never joined the service. I would have stayed home like a good little boy, learned a trade, settled down, and would have had all this to live with. But I can't.